he had taken upon himself, he had taken hold of samadhi for himself and carried that ecstatic joy all the time. So now one day, quite suddenly, he left for Calcutta, carrying that heavenly joy within his heart. So we're starting on President of the Order. The return of Maharaj to Calcutta created a stir among his brother disciples. His presence brought to them a new upsurge of spiritual joy. One day he told Swami Brahmananda, "I was very happy in Vrindavan, but I left the holy city to come and live in the monastery here. I want to serve my brothers and mankind." Our master, Sri Ramakrishna, was the embodiment of supreme love and devotion, so that our own lives must be such that people all over the world, burdened by earthly sufferings and miseries, may learn to take his holy name and in him find peace and rest. When Swamiji, who was still in America, heard of Brahmananda's return to Calcutta, he felt relieved of any further anxiety regarding the conduct of the Ramakrishna Order in India. His letters to Maharaj were full of the spirit of universal service, and Maharaj, in his turn, would inspire his brother disciples with the same ideal. All felt an unbounded confidence in Swamiji and Maharaj, but the love of these two for each other was so deep and so spiritual that no one else could fully understand it. 2 years after Brahmananda's return from Vrindavan, Swamiji came back from America. A public reception was prepared for him at a house in Calcutta, and Maharaj himself was the first to welcome his brother, placing a garland of flowers around his neck. Swamiji, in his turn, touched the feet of Maharaj, quoting a saying from the scriptures. The son of a guru is to be regarded as the guru himself, meaning that Brahmananda was the spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna. Smiling sweetly, Maharaj touched his feet and returned the compliment with another quotation. One's elder brother is to be respected like one's father. Swamiji was then taken to the Alambazar monastery, where he placed in Brahmananda's hand all the money which American devotees had subscribed toward the Indian mission. All this time, he said, "I have been acting as a trustee. It is a relief to give this back to its real owner, our Raja." The natures of the two friends were widely dissimilar, and yet, in a sense, complementary. In the words of Sri Ramakrishna, Narayan dwells in the realm of the absolute, the impersonal. He is like a sharp, drawn sword of discrimination. Rakal dwells in the realm of God, the sweet one, the repository of all blessed qualities. He is like a child on the lap of his mother, completely surrendering himself to her in every way. Vivekananda was like the flaming fire, the midday sun, burning up all evil and impurity. Brahmananda was like a soft, cool light, soothing the aching heart. Vivekananda was like the deep and restless ocean, always fighting against ignorance and superstition. Brahmananda was like the blue sky, vast and patient in spirit. The manner of his working was inward and silent. Vivekananda laid the foundation for the spiritual undertaking entrusted to him by his master. Brahmananda built the edifice. Vivekananda, with his dynamic, aggressive personality, could wake a man from the sleep of ignorance. Brahmananda, with his characteristic serenity, could show him the way to mold his life in God. Each paid memorable tribute to the other. Through Swamiji, said Brahmananda, the world has come to know of Sri Ramakrishna. But for him, very few could have understood our master's genius. In the words of Swamiji, Raja is the greatest treasure house of spirituality. Once, a European devotee came to visit Swamiji in the monastery, wishing to have his spiritual problems solved. Swamiji sent him to Maharaj, saying, "There you will find a dynamo working, and we are all under him." After talking to Maharaj, the devotee expressed his gratitude and told Swamiji that all his doubts had been removed. Swami Sardananda rightly remarks, if Swami Vivekananda was loved and cherished by the Master as the means by which his spiritual mission was to be proclaimed to the world, Swami Brahmananda was no less valued by him as the future head of the organization. We have already described how, before visiting America, Swamiji had spent more than 2 years as a wandering monk, traveling the length and breadth of India. It was at this time that he came to understand the inner source of his country's strength, for he saw how the masses, in spite of their miserable poverty and lack of education, with all their accompanying evils, still held fast to the ancient ideals of religious life. Swamiji's heart thrilled with pride in his country's spiritual greatness and bled for its material distress. When he came to the West, he found the picture exactly reversed. On the one hand, physical comfort, material prosperity, high standards of education, all the achievements of the human intellect. On the other hand, spiritual poverty and a failure to understand life's only purpose, the unfoldment of the God within man. He saw, in short, that the West had failed to accept wholeheartedly the ideals of Jesus Christ. The perfect civilization, Swamiji realized, consists in blending and harmonizing the genius of the East with that of the West. Expressed philosophically, it is the blending of the active with the contemplative life. When Swamiji returned to India, he talked to his brother disciples, giving a new expression to the ideals for which Sri Ramakrishna had stood. It is not enough, he said, to devote your entire life to the realization of God for yourself alone. You must also live for the good of all, for the happiness of all. Swamiji wished his brothers to combine the contemplative life with the life of service to mankind. Brahmananda was the first to recognize the depth and scope of Swamiji's ideals, and he gave them his full support. This was quite interesting because traditionally in India, monks were not serving people. They did not live in one place. They wandered and begged for their living. They were not people who served other people. They simply tried to realize God for themselves. So this was really quite a revolutionary idea in the monasteries in India, in the lives of monks in India, that you must combine the contemplative life with service of mankind. On the first day of May, 1897, Swamiji called a representative meeting of the monastic and lay disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. Excuse me. At this meeting, the organization known as the Ramakrishna Mission was formed. Maharaj was elected president of the Calcutta Center. Later, early in 1902, before the passing away of Swamiji, he was made head of the order, and he held that office for more than 20 years until his own death. The phenomenal growth of the mission during his lifetime is too well known to need recording here. Whenever India has suffered any great flood or famine or other calamity, the monks of the Ramakrishna Order have come forward to relieve the distress of the people. Besides its innumerable emergency relief stations, open temporarily, it has established permanent charitable and religious institutions all over the country. Preaching centers and monasteries have also been opened in Europe and in North and South America. At the beginning of 1899, the permanent headquarters of the mission were established at Belur on the Ganges, now well known as Belur Mat. Foreign visitors to India have spoken highly in appreciation of the mission's success in social service. To the monks of the order, however, such success can be only of secondary importance. Maharaj always insisted on this. The one purpose of life is to know God, plunge deep into the sea of bliss and become immortals, attain knowledge and devotion, then serve God and mankind. Work is not the end of life. Disinterested work is a means of attaining devotion. Meditate, and dive deep within. Know that God alone is real. Keep at least 3/4 of your mind in God. It is enough if you give 1/4 to service, work, and worship. A young disciple of Swamiji, inspired by his ideals of renunciation and service, devoted himself to nursing the sick and helping the poor. From a very humble beginning, his work grew into a huge organization. For many years, this disciple was the head of one of the largest homes of service in India under the Ramakrishna Mission. But when Maharaj saw that his work was becoming more important to him than his spiritual life, he relieved him of the post, inspired him with the ideal of realizing God, and sent him away to live a life of exclusive meditation. To quote Maharaj again, yes, you must work, but I insist that you devote yourselves to spiritual practices and meditation. Even though I may not ask you to work, your nature will force you to work. It is difficult to engage the mind in contemplation of God, but you are monks. Therefore, work must not be the sole purpose of your lives. At one time, a millionaire who had lost his wife came to the monastery and said he wished to renounce the world and give all his wealth to the Ramakrishna Mission. Swami Brahmananda reported this to Maharaj, who folded his hands and said gently, "Brother, a worldly man who associates with a holy man like yourself naturally becomes inspired by the ideal of renunciation. Shall we, in our turn, become worldly because we have met a worldly man?" Maharaj refused to accept the money because he knew very well that the millionaire would later regret his offering, being, as he was, very much attached to his wealth. In the same way, he refused a gift of real estate, knowing that the emotion which prompted the offer was merely temporary. He realized that the work of the mission could not prosper unless it was founded on a firm spiritual basis. Maharaj was more interested in the spiritual growth of his disciples than in their efficiency. He once reprimanded a senior disciple who had been put in charge of a younger brother, saying, "Did I send this young boy to you to make a good clerk out of him?" On another occasion, when a senior disciple of Swamiji was taking one of the younger disciples to task for negligence in some duty, Maharaj overheard the conversation and told him, "Of course, it is wrong that if this young man neglects his allotted duty, you have the right to scold him for that. But tell me, Do you ever inquire if he is doing his duty to himself? Do you ask him if he is meditating regularly or if he has any difficulties in his progress towards God? Is the work of the mission more important to you than this boy's spiritual growth? Maharaj placed special importance on what he called Sahaja Yoga, which means the easy way to attain the knowledge of God, and that is constant recollectedness. He used to say, make japam, repeat the name of the Lord. Whatever you do, let the name of God flow like a current within you. While it is true that Maharaj held the ideal of selfless service, of serving God and man, to be a form of worship, he pointed out that without the practice of meditation, it is hard to do work as worship, and that it is utterly impossible to annihilate the ego simply by actions, however selfless the work may be. We must act, but we must also try by our meditation to merge the ego in God. Jesus said, love thy neighbor as thyself. But to really love mankind, an aspirant must also learn to love God with all his heart, his soul, and his mind. Maharaj once told me, my boy, devote yourself to spiritual practices, attain knowledge and devotion. Then you will see how your heart will overflow with love and sympathy for mankind. You will also find out how unnecessary is man's suffering, carrying as he does this mine of bliss within himself. Maharaj kept a watchful eye on the progress of each member of the order. He turned our hearts continually toward God and directed our actions and activities of the mission toward the integrating of that inner strength which alone can benefit mankind physically, morally, and spiritually. When young men of varied temperaments live together, it is only natural that misunderstandings will arise from time to time, no matter how high their common ideal may be. In one of the monasteries connected with the home of service, there were a number of young, untrained members, newly arrived from school and college. When they had been together a while, their old tendencies began to reassert themselves. They formed rival groups and started to quarrel. A senior Swami of the order went to investigate. After questioning everybody, he soon found out who were the ringleaders. He then wrote to Swami Brahmananda, telling him that some of those boys were unfit for monastic life and should be expelled. Maharaj replied, "Don't do anything. I'm coming to see for myself." When Maharaj arrived, he asked no questions. He lived quietly in the monastery, insisting only on one thing, that all the boys should meditate regularly in his presence. Then he began to instruct them, making no distinction between the good and the bad. Gradually, the whole atmosphere of the place improved. The boys forgot their quarrels because they no longer had any time for them. And when Maharaj left, 2 or 3 months later, perfect harmony had been restored in the monastery. Nobody had been expelled. All the boys had become better and more spiritual. At another time, 2 young monks quarreled and came to blows. Swami Brahmananda heard of it and went anxiously to Maharaj, saying, "Maharaj, we brother disciples have lived together in peace and harmony for many years. Never have we fought or quarreled. Never has a harsh word been spoken among us. What shall we do with these boys? Ought we not to expel them?" "Brother," Swami Brahmananda answered gently, "it is true that they have been making trouble. But remember also that they came here to take refuge at the blessed feet of Sri Ramakrishna. They look to you for counsel and guidance. Surely you can do something to transform their lives and bring love into their hearts." "You are right," Swami Brahmananda replied. "They have taken refuge here. But brother, it is you who must bless them and transform them." Then Swami Brahmananda gathered the monks together, seniors and novices alike, and led them in procession to Maharaj. With folded hands, the Swami asked Maharaj to bless them all. As he spoke, Maharaj entered into an exalted spiritual mood. He became deeply absorbed, and his right hand was raised in benediction. Seeing this, Swami Brahmananda asked Swami Shuddhananda, a senior disciple of Swamiji, to prostrate before Maharaj and receive his blessing. Thereupon, every monk and every initiate followed his example, and Maharaj touched the head of each with his uplifted hand. Speaking from my own experience, I can only say that that touch was like a cooling spring to a fevered body. It gave one an inner exaltation which could be felt but not described. All our troubles were forgotten, and our hearts were full of love. "Keep your mind as high as the mountains," Maharaj told a disciple whom he was sending to a monastery in the Himalayas. He himself lived always in an exalted state of consciousness, which subtly transformed the lives and characters of those around him. If the spiritual life is intensified, the outer life will adjust itself automatically. This principle applies equally to the life of an organization. Maharaj was once asked to make some new rules for the guidance of young monks. He replied, "Swamiji has already made our rules for us. We do not need to add any new ones. Add more love, attain more devotion, and help others to move toward the ideal of God." As the network of monasteries and homes of service spread over India, Maharaj began to visit them, staying a few months at each place. He inspired everyone by his presence, and an air of festivity prevailed everywhere he went. Once, in speaking of him, Swami Turiyananda quoted a verse from the Bhagavatam. "Those who realize the eternal presence of the Lord in their hearts are endowed with goodness and beauty, and their lives are a perpetual festival of joy." Then he added, "Maharaj carries with him such an intense spiritual atmosphere that whoever comes within his orbit is carried toward God as if by a spiritual current and is filled with divine joy." Once a professor who had lived for a week in the monastery which Maharaj was visiting said to me, "I don't know what kind of boys you are, but if you can live in that rarefied atmosphere of Maharaj day after day, you must be great. I myself cannot stand it for long. I need to breathe a little worldly air." However, after this, the professor could not breathe his worldly air for long. Maharaj had given him a taste of the joy of God. Soon afterward, he came back and joined the order. Though Maharaj could not be in all the centers at once and live with all of his disciples, he kept a watchful eye on everybody. One day he said to me, "Do you think I don't know what you boys have been doing and how you have been faring in the path to God? I may stay in one place and seem unconcerned, but I know what is happening to each one of you. I even know what blank is doing in America." Maharaj possessed this knowledge not through the ordinary means of communication, but through extraordinary power. However, he was not satisfied with merely knowing. He sent spiritual aid to everyone in need. If a member of the order should be guilty of some serious offense, and there would be talk of his expulsion, Maharaj would forgive his misdeeds and transform him by his touch. He used to say The sins of many births can be wiped out in a moment by one glance from the gracious eye of God. Once he said, "What is morality? If one acquires devotion to God, morality and purity will follow without one even trying to be moral or pure." Practice, practice, he would tell us. Through practice of the spiritual disciplines, the heart will be purified and a new realm will open. You will realize that God alone is real and that everything else is unreal. But when, through japa and meditation, a little awakening comes, do not imagine you have achieved the end. Light, more light, onward, onward, attain God, gain his vision, talk to him. The success of a religious body depends not on its external achievements, its efficient organization, its buildings, the size of its membership, or its philanthropic activities, but upon the inner life of each of its members and the measure of our progress towards devotion and knowledge of God. This is the truth that Maharaj, as head of the order, impressed indelibly upon our minds. Now, since that's the end of the chapter, are there any questions or discussions about anything that's basically the formation of the Ramakrishna Mission? Difference between the Mat and Mission: the Mats are monasteries devoted to contemplation. The missions are homes of service, hospitals, which are actively serving mankind. They have schools, hospitals, dispensaries, libraries, everything you can name that will help uplift people in their daily life. And it's also the basis of the entire structure of all of the convents and monasteries in trying to balance the life we have. Meditation is a big part of our life. Also work. We have our scheduled work, our work for people, and it's to create a balance of the two, of both halves of your being and your life. And I think everyone can apply that in their own lives wherever they are. Make sure you have a little time for meditation every day. Make sure you go to your shrine, do your japa, and also do your work with an unselfish attitude. He basically set up how every one of us can go along on the path to realize God. Whether we be in a monastery or a convent or in the world, we have jobs that we must do. But yeah, it's basically how everyone can realize God. And that's what makes this book one of the most popular books among the monks of the order. Many of the monks say it's one of the books that they carry with them all the time, or reread over and over again, because the teachings don't get old. Well, we can start with Maharaj's Guru, but this is, it's not too long a chapter. We can start if no one has any comments or additions that they'd like to, questions that they have. Okay. Sri Ramakrishna once said, "When the lotus blooms, bees come of their own accord to gather the honey. When the lotus of a man's heart blossoms in the joy of God, spiritual aspirants will swarm to him." Many times we have watched Maharaj sitting among a crowd of devotees. One moment he would be as happy and playful as a child. Then suddenly his mind would become indrawn and the whole atmosphere would vibrate with the presence of God. At such times, those who had come to visit him would find that all their doubts and problems had been solved. They would rise and leave his presence, exalted and comforted, though not a single word had been spoken. Some of you may have experienced this in the presence of your own guru. You think you have all these questions, and then you go in and you think, oh, well, no, I don't need to ask that one. And you find you're not asking the questions that you went in, but you feel like they have been answered. The monastic order included many disciples of Holy Mother and Swamiji, but most of these had little opportunity of associating with their gurus. Swamiji passed away in 1902, and because Holy Mother did not live at the monastery, she instructed her disciples to follow the disciplines prescribed by Maharaj. Maharaj himself also accepted disciples, but at first he was very particular. Often he would initiate them only after many years of probation. During the ceremony of initiation, he would be filled with an ecstasy of love, and the disciple would feel an extraordinary sense of the divine presence. Holy Mother once complained that Maharaj did not accept enough disciples. It so happened that just then Maharaj was invited to see a play about the life of Ramanuja, which had been written by one of his own disciples. In this drama, there was a scene which expresses Ramanuja's great love for mankind. The action is as follows. Ramanuja's guru initiates him with a sacred mantra and warns him never to reveal it to anyone. What will happen if I do? Ramanuja asks. And his guru replies, whoever hears this mantra will be liberated from the bondage of his ignorance, but you yourself will suffer damnation. Ramanuja goes at once into the temple, gathers a crowd around him, and utters the sacred mantra in the hearing of all. His guru pretends to be very angry and rebukes him for his disobedience. Ramanuja answers, if my damnation can liberate so many people, then my supreme desire is to be damned. The guru is delighted. You are great indeed, he exclaims. I give you my blessing. And he declares that the philosophy of qualified monism is to be known in the future as the Ramanuja philosophy. This drama and Holy Mother's remark both made a deep impression upon Maharaj. After this, he initiated many more disciples. Maharaj recognized his future disciples at first sight and bound them to him at once with an indescribable love. Even as he met them, he knew which spiritual path they should follow. 2 young college boys came to visit him. To one of them he said, jokingly, let me see your palm. As he looked at it, he remarked, you have a tendency toward worldly enjoyments, but by the Lord's grace, you may be able to overcome it. Swami Brahmananda, who was present, asked Maharaj to look at the other boy's hand also. He replied, smiling, I don't need to. Hearing this, the other boy, who was later to be known as Swami Yatishwarananda, felt sad. He thought, my friend has some chance of becoming a monk, but I have none. A few days later, he came alone to visit Maharaj at the Belar Monastery. He met Swami Brahmananda's personal attendant, who told him, Maharaj said that you would become a monk. And indeed, he did. A few years later, he became a monk, while the other boy married, but remained a devotee. Before Yatishwarananda became a monk, Maharaj told him, give your body and mind to worldly enjoyments, and the world will destroy them both. Devote them to God and his service, and you will enjoy bodily health, peace of mind, and spiritual joy. Have any of you read, what's the name of Yatishwarananda's book?
Meditation and Spiritual Life.
I'm sorry?
Meditation and Spiritual Life.
Yeah, Meditation and Spiritual Life. It's an absolute tome on everything that has to do with spiritual life. He also wrote How to Seek God. He's written many, many books. But I think we'll stop there. And Saturday, we will have the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna at 5 o'clock. I don't believe we're going to have, the lecture will be a Hollywood lecture or one other. We won't have one out of Santa Barbara. So it's simply that. But we do still, we have hopes of opening June 1st, which would be for lectures, classes, and vespers. The temple would not be open all day. It would only be open for those events. So keep looking at our website because things change all the time. We'll end with the chant. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu